Welcome to the next webinar of the World Value Survey Association. We are very happy to welcome you to our today's June webinar on understanding global attitudes toward abortion. We are very happy to have with us our guest speaker, Amy Adamchuk from John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, who will present for us on this topic today and will share research based on the World Value Survey data in her latest book. The book draws on the data from over 200,000 individual interviews in 88 countries, which participated in waves 5, 6, and 7 of the World Value Survey, and Amy examines how support for abortion varies across societies and over time. This is a very exciting study. The new book is brand new, just out in February this year. And the study finds that national differences in abortion attitudes are shaped not only by individual characteristics, but also by broader societal factors such as religion, inequality, and levels of global development. We are very happy to have Amy with us today. Let me add a few more attendees to this session. And Amy, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. These data have been absolutely wonderful. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk with the broader community about the findings regarding these data. So I'm going to be talking about some of the information in my book. So Fetal Positions, Understanding Cross-National Public Opinion About Abortion just came out in February. 200,000 individuals, 88 nations. There's also a big content analysis of 800 newspaper articles and 40 interviews with claims makers in China and the United States. So we have limited time today. So I'm just going to be talking about a few of the major findings that I think this group will be interested in. So I'll focus on religion and abortion attitudes, and I'll also talk a little bit about economics and education, and also China's one-child-only policy for shaping how people, especially in China, are likely to view abortion today. So the presentation outline is such that I'm first going to talk about differences across the world with regards to laws and policies, and also with regards to attitudes. And then I'll break it down and talk a little bit about what I mean and what many other researchers mean about macro and micro differences. I'll then talk about the theory and the survey data specifically with regards to religion. And then the last portion of the talk, I'll move over and talk about attitudinal changes within China. So as many of you know, across the world, there are really big differences in the legislation regarding abortion. So if you look at the map here, you can see that the areas that are in blue indicate where abortion is legal on demand during the first trimester. And that encompasses much of Europe, and it used to encompass much of North America. Now it just includes Canada. Within the United States, as many of you know, things recently changed. They actually changed 3 years ago this week, whereby in many states, abortion is not allowed on demand, and women have to find other ways of managing that situation. In the global south, things are very different. And so here you can see the areas in yellow and in pink and in red. This is where it becomes much more difficult to obtain an abortion, where it is illegal under most circumstances. In the red areas, it's actually prohibited altogether. Now, abortion laws often, although not always, correspond with a public opinion about abortion. And so here you can see that, again, in the global north, in the areas that are yellow and blue, these are the most liberal parts of the globe. And people are relatively tolerant about abortion. And in the global south, that's where you see this red and to some extent those green areas, people are less tolerant about this issue. Now, surprisingly, there's actually limited research on the multi-level factors shaping cross-national abortion attitudes. Within individual countries, there's actually a lot of research on abortion attitudes, especially if you focus on North America and Europe. So, for example, in the United States, there have been dozens and dozens of studies looking at how various factors shape disapproval of abortion in the United States. If you go to Germany, you're going to find the same thing. If you go to the UK, you're going to find something similar. Australia has several studies in this area. What we haven't had until relatively recently is a look at the factors shaping cross-national views about abortion. And the work that has existed has not done a lot of it very well, or they haven't done it correctly by accounting for the fact that individuals within the same country are more similar to each other than individuals from two different nations. It's much easier to study abortion laws than attitudes. Every nation has a law on the book, and so there's been some work on what are the factors shaping abortion laws. And early sociologists were very interested in contextual effects. I'm trained as a sociologist, and they wanted to understand how the surrounding environment influences people's views. So it is a little surprising that a lot of the work on public opinion, and especially what might be referred to as morality issues, really hasn't received much attention. And so there's definitely space for more of this to be done. And my book is trying to address that concern. So when we think about the factors that shape abortion attitudes, they can be broken down into what would be called macro and micro effects. And so at the micro level, that's the individual in the very middle of that circle. Individuals have characteristics, gender, they have educational levels, they have levels of income that can shape how they see abortion. But we don't want to stop there. The world in which individuals move, the larger context of the country, the national effect, the societal effect, can also have an influence on how individuals view various issues, including abortion. And so macro level effects would refer to things happening at the country level. So this is the level of democracy, the level of economic development, the level of gender equality. And again, at the micro level, that's your personal religious beliefs. That's how much money you make. That's your, level of education. And in the presentation that I'm giving to you today, I'm going to focus on religion. So religion as both a macro effect. You're not religious, but you happen to live in a more religious country. How does that shape how you view abortion? And in later chapters in the book, I talk about the other types of macro effects that are likely to shape individual views. So again, this is over and above your personal characteristics. How does the larger country affect how you view things? Okay, so moving on to the theoretical underpinnings of why religion would shape views about abortion, and also the survey data analysis. So when researchers talk about the effect of religion, especially at the micro level, your religious beliefs or how you view religion, we usually measure it in two ways. One is your personal religious affiliation. So what religion do you affiliate with? Are you Catholic? Are you Protestant? Are you Muslim? Are you Hindu? Are you Buddhist? Those are the 5 major religions. So do you affiliate with any of those? Now, you might think religious affiliation would matter, but here's the deal. With regards to abortion, all of the major religions have some problem with it. Okay, so they all, to some extent, in various degrees, say abortion is problematic. So if we're only going to focus on religious affiliation or differences between religious affiliation, there's good reason to think we're not going to find a lot of big effects. Because if all the major religions say this is problematic, then it may not matter if you're Catholic or if you're Protestant. Secondly, researchers often measure personal religious beliefs. In the World Values Survey, we have a measure of religious importance, and it's simply a question that asks, how important is religion to you? Rather than religious affiliation, I make the case in the book that what we really need to focus on is religious importance, like the salience of those beliefs. Whatever that religion is, how strong do you feel about that religion? So if you take religion seriously, we would think that people would be more opposed to abortion. So why would that be? Well, when people feel strongly about their religion, they're going to learn through their religion that abortion is problematic. Social control mechanisms. When people are more religious, when they say religion is important in my life, they're going to engage with their religion more, and they're going to develop more relationships with other religious people. And as a result of that, they're going to be more likely to disapprove of abortion because they care what these other people think of them. So that's important as well. And then finally, there's a process that I'm referring to as routine activities theory. And the basic idea here is that abortion is highly stigmatized in many, many contexts. And what that means is that women who get abortions are not going to want to share that information. And they're especially not going to want to share that information with people they think are going to disapprove, and that's going to be religious people. What that then does for those other religious people is it makes them think they don't know anybody who got an abortion, or they don't know the circumstances by which a woman might need an abortion, or they might find abortion problematic, and they don't think they know anybody who's ever gotten one. And so that changes how they think about the issue too. The more that you know about abortion, or the more that you think you know people that have gotten abortions, that's going to affect how you view it more generally. All right, so that's at the micro level. What would we think would matter at the macro level? Well, again, we can look at the proportion Catholic, the proportion Muslim, and the proportion, Protestant. But what is likely to matter even more is just overall levels of religious belief. So when a country has high levels of religious importance, that is going to trickle down, and it's likely to seep into public discourse, public institutions. It's going to affect legal codes. It's going to affect who people see in positions of power, if that's going to be women or if that's going to be men. It's going to affect social norms. It's going to trickle down and shape the media, the information that people are likely to get within society. And all of that is going to shape how individuals, even if they're not personally religious, are going to view this issue regarding abortion. All right, so let's test these ideas. Let's see, how religion sorts out. So to do this, I use World Values Survey data, waves 5, 6, and 7, 200,000 people, so massive, massive number of people, 88 countries, including China, so we have the majority of the world's population. And the outcome is going to be, can abortion always be justified, never justified, or something in between? I want to note that the World Values Survey is valuable for many reasons, but there are very few cross-national surveys that ask about abortion. Many of the ones that exist are just done in the global north, or they're just done in European countries. So the WVS is just extremely important for understanding this issue across many different nations. So unfortunately, I'm glad it has a question, but unfortunately it only has one question across many, many different nations. And again, I just want to note that this is a question about morality. All right. The question is not asking, should abortion be legal? That's a legal issue. This is a moral issue. And this is going to come up later, because when I talk about China, you'll remember what dimension we're talking about here. All right, so the models that I'm going to show to you, these were produced through hierarchical linear modeling. It includes all the control variables that you would think would be important, and it includes the country level factors as well. So, level of democracy within a country, gender inequality, communist history, economic and educational development. Weights are on, and missing data has been appropriately dealt with. It's listwise deleted, but I've done the same analysis using multiple imputation techniques. So the full models are in the book. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time today, so I'm not going to give you all of that today, but do take a look at the book if you want to learn more. And what I'm just going to give you now are the marginal values based on those full models, all right? Okay, so what do we find? Well, first off, let's talk about religious affiliation. Those lines on the edge of your screen, those are called confidence intervals. When they overlap, it means there are no statistically significant differences between these groups. For the most part, religious affiliation just doesn't matter that much. So even look at the Catholics. I want you to take a close look. You're thinking, the Catholics, come on. No, they're really not that different than the Protestants and the Hindus and the Muslims for the most part. There are a few differences. So Jews, as we often find, we start finding these a lot in the United States, are more liberal. People who didn't pick a religion are on the more liberal end. But in general, the action is not with regards to religious affiliation. Where is the action? The action is with regards to religious importance, whatever that religion is. And what I'm showing you here are the marginal effects for the micro effect of religious importance, and also the macro effect of religious importance. And they're all included in the same model with all of those controls that you saw. And I think what's really key here is, one, that religious importance very much matters, both at micro and macro levels. Again, those confidence intervals, now you see them, they're not overlapping. Okay, that means there's differences between them. And secondly, that the effect at the individual level is as powerful as the effect at the macro level. This is really interesting because many people living in more religious countries may think, oh, I'm not religious, so this doesn't affect how I view abortion. That's not what I'm finding. I'm finding that there is very much a trickle-down effect. You are being affected by the environment that you live in and how religion is moving through that space in a variety of different ways. So I think that's really important for understanding global abortion disapproval. And secondly, I did find that the proportion Catholic was associated with not a huge, but a small decrease in support for abortion. So that's what you can see here. But the thing to keep in mind is that I didn't find a personal Catholic effect. So it's not Catholic affiliation that is really driving that influence. It's the proportion Catholic within the country, which I think makes a lot of sense when you think about Poland or you think about South America, where you have a high proportion of Catholics. It relates, and the book talks a lot about this, to how the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church has interwoven itself into the government, into the media, into the primary institutions in these countries, as well as how people identify. So the book, like I say, is going to talk a lot more about that, but it's not so much that Catholics per se are more opposed to abortion. It's really about what's happening at that macro effect with regards to the proportion Catholic. No significant effects for proportion Muslim or Protestant. All right, so what other macro effects are important for shaping public opinion about abortion across the world? The book is going to talk a lot more about those other macro level effects. There are several things that I don't find to be statistically significant or that have a lot of explanatory power. That doesn't mean that they're not important within individual countries, but rather that these other things might be working as mediators. So, more democratic nations may have a certain characteristic, and then that is then shaping how individuals see these issues. Okay, so on to the latter part of this discussion, which is going to focus in on changes within China. All right, so the World Value Survey, and I'm going to come back, I'm going to show you more about the World Value Survey here in just a minute. But one of the challenges with survey data, and we all have this challenge, is that the whole point is to try to capture large trends. And with the World Value Survey, that's large trends across the globe. And it's wonderful because it can help you isolate what's happening in many different places and give you like that bird's eye perspective. But the challenge with that is that it doesn't provide much information about specific countries. And so you may think, oh, is this happening in every single country? Well, no. I mean, countries have individual trajectories and individual histories, and that matters as well. And so in the book, what I did is I also present a comparative case study of views about abortion in China and the United States. So I can contrast them against each other. So you get this large, bird's eye view of things, but then you can go into specific countries and say, okay, this is how this is played out within these places. So why did I pick China and the United States? You may initially think, oh, those are such strange comparisons. There's some really good reasons for it. One is that we know a lot about the global north. That is where the research action has been for a very long time. We know much less about other parts of the world, especially when we focus in on non-Christian or non-monotheistic countries. And so I think it's important to bring those other countries into this conversation. Secondly, between the United States and China, we have two of the three most populous nations in the world. So if you capture what's happening in those countries, you actually capture, a minority, but you do gain insight into what is happening with the world's population. The United States and China have very different policy contexts. Ironically, in the book, I actually find some really neat similarities between these nations, but that makes for another interesting reason for why we might want to pay attention to what's happening because of these histories. Also, there's been almost nothing written about abortion views in China. I spent a lot of time trying to find that work, and there's almost nothing there. As I mentioned, in other places, including like the United States, there's just a whole lot. The research infrastructure is just really built up, and there's just a lot going on. So let's take a look what's happening in China. So to carry out the comparative analysis, amongst other things, I used interviews. So I did 40 interviews in the United States and China. I did more in China than the United States. Again, we know more about the U.S., so it's not as much of a mystery what's happening there. All of these interviews were done during COVID. So it was a very interesting time. And during the discussion, I can talk a little bit about the reaction of the Chinese when I was trying to do all of this over the phone. I did have a grant to go there in person, and nobody could go anywhere, and certainly not China. So this was all done through WhatsApp and other mechanisms, since that was the only option. And I used a theoretical sampling approach to gather experts. And so these were not people who had abortions, although some did. These were experts. So these were people who could tell me something about the public, who could say, hey, yeah, I can tell you a little bit about how people might think about this issue. And so that included researchers, professors, religious leaders, medical doctors, civil servants, and then in the US, social movement activists. There were no social movement activists that I spoke to in China. And so that's going to, give me a lot of context. So I would say, well, how do you think the Chinese view this issue? And then they would give me that information. So I'm going to touch a little bit on the interview data, but just a little bit. I've got more real value survey information to share with you. And throughout the book, the survey and the interviews talk to each other, so they're not compartmentalized. They run throughout both. All right, so let's talk about fascinating issue, which is the one-child only policy and how that changed views about abortion in China. So one-child only policy was implemented in the 1970s in China. And the basic idea is that couples, for the most part, were limited to having just one child. So two people could have one child, and it's to reduce the size of the population in China, which was very big when this policy went into effect. Today, China has very low birth rates, and they're actually having the opposite problem. They want to have more babies. They don't want to have fewer. The policy stayed in effect until 2016, and so I was doing my interviews in 2020. I'll also say, as of 2021, many couples in China can now have up to 3 children. So it's again, the government is trying to increase birth rates, not make them decline. And just as a side note, because this came up in the interviews, in many other Southeast Asian countries, China's neighbors, birth rates decline naturally. So a lot of times when nations become richer, they call it the economic paradox, or economic demographic paradox. Richer nations tend to prefer smaller families. And so the neighbors without this policy often found that birth rates were decreasing. All right, so when I started talking to the Chinese, I was not focused on the one-child only policy, but it certainly came up in our interviews. In fact, if I did ask about it, and I had to ask a little bit about it, everybody talked about abortion. Okay, so that's number one interesting thing. So, and this is how they talked about it. They would say things like, here's one Buddhist monk, moving my screen around here. Buddhist monk, he says, people would just be dragged to the hospital and forced to get abortions. Here's a Chinese academic living in the United States. She says, I learned what an abortion was as a child. Some laborers had an unauthorized pregnancy. So then they were caught, and then they had to get an abortion. And then there was another person that I spoke to, and she told me this, she was laughing when she told me this, and everything worked out okay. But she said, look, when I was a child, there were government officials that were coming to our house because my mom was pregnant, and my mom would go hide at the neighbor's house, and the government officials would bribe me with candy to get them to tell me where my mom was. And they told me that if I had a little brother, which she did eventually, but if she had one, that her parents wouldn't love her. So this is what the government officials were saying. So throughout the interviews, residents often talked about their localized experience with regards to abortion. And again, I was not asking these experts about their personal experiences about abortion. I was asking them to comment about how the public views this issue. And I make the case that this very much shaped how many people in China, even to this day, still think and talk about abortion. Now, it wasn't just forced abortions. That was probably a very small part of it. There were a lot of restrictions that would happen if you did have an unauthorized child. You could lose your job. So here's one Chinese academic saying if you didn't have this ticket, she referred to it as a ticket, you would lose your job if you had a child outside of it. I talked to a lot of Chinese ministers in China. Actually, so many I had to actually told them I can't talk to anybody anymore. They were wonderful. And so one of them was telling me that he had a friend growing up, and he said his name was $6,000 because he was the second child in the family, and that's what his parents had to pay to the government in order to have a second child, right? Here's another Chinese professor, and they say so everything surrounding having a baby or having an abortion, but would be related to the government. So I was doing these interviews in 2020. It's 4 years past when the one-child only policy ended, and people, even if they didn't go through any of this kind of trauma or thinking about it, it was very much on their minds. And when I talked to people in rural areas, some of them suggested that in rural areas, this policy, this one child only policy, was especially harsh because in rural areas, a lot of times there was very much a very strong patrilineal society. And so they wanted to have boys. Boys were very much valued. And so with the one child only policy, the pressure was on because if you had a girl, you had one shot. You couldn't keep having kids until you had the boy that you might have desired. That would become very expensive very quickly. Now, the policy did vary in some areas, so people could have two under certain circumstances or certain ethnic groups, but it didn't take away from the fact that the pressure was on to have boys, especially in rural areas. And so, here's a good example of a Chinese professor talking about living in a rural area. She said she had a female friend with a Chinese name that meant younger brother. So her friend was actually called younger brother. So the hope was that the parents next one would be a younger brother. So rural residents may have seen the one-child policy and abortions as really, as problematic, as especially problematic. And so my argument, I make this argument in the book. I also have a paper out that goes into this in further depth. The one-child policy has had an enduring effect on how the Chinese public view abortion. That's my perspective, my hypothesis. So let's test this a little bit. Let's see if this is really happening. All right, so what I have in front of you here, these are changes over time with regards to attitudes about abortion. Now, it's that same real values survey question that's asking about the moral aspects of abortion. It's not asking if abortion should be illegal or not. And if you were to ask that in China, I think you'd get a very different perspective. This is about, is abortion always justified, and changes over time. And you can see in 1990s, this is the second wave. This is the first time China was included in the WVS. People are pretty tolerant. They're, so higher numbers in here mean more opposed. Okay, so that red line is China. It's getting higher. You can see that over time, China has definitely become more opposed to abortion, at least the more saying they're more, less and less likely to say that abortion is always justified. And the other countries, I have them in there, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, these are China's Confucian neighbors. We're not seeing that same trend line there. So it does suggest that something very unique is happening within China. So then I had the question, well, maybe it's not about abortion, but it's about any sexual morality issue. And so I looked to see, because the Real Values Survey also asked the very same question, exact same question about homosexuality and prostitution. And so I wanted to see, well, is disapproval for those issues going up as well? And you can see here, China again is in the red. For the most part, we're not finding that in China at all. So with regards to homosexuality across the globe, things have become more liberal. You can see, even in these Confucian countries, it's become more liberal. Even in China, it looks like they've become more liberal on the issue of the same-sex relationships. With regards to prostitution, there's a lot of opposition to that in China, but over time, we don't see that it necessarily increases. It looks like it actually decreases a little, but you can see in comparison with regards to abortion that there's something very distinct. It looks like there's something very distinct happening. So then the question is I mentioned earlier that the people in rural areas in China may have been especially frustrated with the one-child policy. So I want to see, were there differences over time between rural and urban residents? In other words, is that change in China being driven, at least in part, by rural residents? Okay, so this is, again, Real Value Survey data. And here I'm going just down into China because I want to compare the Chinese rural versus urban residents. And what you're going to see here, this is just a regular OLS regression model with controls at the individual level included as they should be. And what this says is that that year variable it's very clear. Yes, over time, the Chinese have become because remember higher numbers mean more opposition, have become more opposed over time. Then I look at urban and rural differences. This is in the first model there. And what you find is just as you would expect, the rural residents are even more opposed to abortion than the urban residents. And so then my question is are the rural residents, did they get more opposed over time? And so in model two, I'm including an interaction term there, and you'll see those asterisks, they're not there. That means that everybody in China got more opposed over time. So both rural and urban residents, moved in the same direction. It's not necessarily, at least with these data, it does not look like it's the rural residents that are driving the differences. Okay, so so all of these interviews sort of point to this frustration with the one-child only policy and regards to abortion. I just want to highlight again that question that I'm using is a moral aspect of abortion. Again, it's not a legal aspect. In fact, I think if I went and asked my respondents how would they feel about not having legal access to abortion, I think they'd be resounding no. That would be really problematic. But it's about kind of how this issue has gotten framed over time and government intervention in it. So in 1971, and here's what a Chinese researcher is kind of referring to, she said, look, I think the first one-child policy was really because of the economic constraints of the country. We cannot afford to feed all of these people and find them all jobs. There was a sense of the government is almost helping us. Like, what are we going to do? Like, it's too big. We can't manage this. But then over time, especially the researchers I talked to, they were very aware that the fertility rates in other countries naturally dropped. And so there was a little bit of this frustration. So they said, here's a Chinese professor saying, I think that if we never had that policy ever, I think the birth rate would finally go down, like in Korea and Japan. They never had that one-child policy. It's just with social development, with the financial issues like women going to work and so forth, it decreases. All right, so that's my argument for what happened in China is that increasing frustration. Like, why didn't the government end the policy much sooner? They didn't need to keep it. It's a really draconian policy. It's pretty wild when you think about it in retrospect. And even if women themselves hadn't experienced that, it was part of the collective way of thinking about abortion. Now, all right, the policy's changed. So I'm doing these interviews in 2020. The policy changed in 2016. People could have more kids. Some of the people I talked to were of an age where they had one child, they could have more if they wanted to. And so I asked them, hey, you can have more kids now. What do you want to do? And they were like, no way, Amy, we're not doing that. So multiple respondents said the Chinese they're not interested in this. They're very practical. They said they're just calculating the costs. They're calculating the financial costs, the career costs, the costs on everything for doing this. And China is expensive for some things. Like childcare is really expensive in China. This isn't out of the blue. It totally makes sense with how challenging it can be to raise children in China. Here's a Catholic sister. She just chooses like, no, even though cognitively they understand that the church might find this problematic, they're going to prioritize other things, their financial situation, their careers, so forth. All right, so that was their response. I think many of you may know this, but there's a very rich history of research, including work connected to Ronald Inglehart, finding that as nations become more economically developed, the values in those nations tend to switch. And so people start focusing on other things. We call that kind of the link between survivalism versus self-expression. And I do think in my book, I talk a lot more about this, and I find those effects across the globe with regards to abortion. So I definitely see these shifts when you look at nations of different levels of economic development. The thing that I just want to highlight here in these two figures is that in a lot of parts of the world, or maybe not a lot, but in the global north, economic development happened really slowly. So the Industrial Revolution in the United States, for example, took more like 100 years. It went slow and gradual, and The changes were there. In a place like China, or China is really a fascinating place, they went through this in about 30 or 40 years. So the changes are just vast. And when I talked to respondents, they very much were thinking in terms of economic sort of calculus about how to think about these various issues. So every Chinese I spoke to talked about economic, educational, career, time, and opportunity costs of having children. So here's one Buddhist monk, and he just said, but now in modern societies, the cost of raising a child is just really high. So for most families, if you have two children, that's more than enough. Because remember, now they can have three. So I was curious if they were going to get any big families. Here's another Chinese academic. Having children is much more constraining to women's self-development. So people talked a lot about gender inequality, which I go into further in the book. So here's another one says, so now many more women are entering the labor force. They don't have to depend on their marriages anymore. They don't feel like they have to get married and have children. Like those are the only options in their lives. And I'll just add to this. I mean, keep in mind, for many of the women in China now, one, they grew up without siblings, right? So they were only children. So it's an interesting context to be thinking about. But also, number two, they witnessed their moms oftentimes work outside of the home because remember, they didn't have large families. They couldn't. It was just very constrained. So the messaging that they were getting, they don't have the same types of role models for having a big family or for some of these more traditional gender roles that you will find in other places. So that's not to say that there isn't quite a bit of gender inequality, which I think is a real challenge in China, but just that people are very much questioning of this because it isn't a part of how they're typically thinking about these things. So in China, very practical concerns seem to really matter: economics, education, social mobility, gender equality. I do talk in the book about religion in China, which is a fascinating place to think about religion, and also I think really useful for sociologists of religion because there hasn't been much work on this in a place like China with polytheistic religious beliefs. But in general, it didn't come up. It came up in some unique ways, but not in general. It wasn't obviously a big factor, whereas it was in the United States. All the interviews talked about religion in the United States for shaping public opinion about abortion. All right, so in summary, personal religious importance is the strongest individual factor. Country levels of religiosity was explained the most variation at the macro level. So I tested that. So I looked at how they relate to other micro and macro factors. Religion is the story very much around the globe about shaping public opinion about abortion. There are few differences between religious affiliates, so the action is not there. That's not where people should be looking for effects. It's really about strength of what we call religiosity and also at the macro level. Also, the proportion Catholic, there's a small effect, but it's not about Catholic affiliates. That's not it. It's about, I think the Catholic Church has just been really successful with its hierarchical structure and its clear messaging about abortion. And a lot of people connect with the Catholic Church through, country identity and other mechanisms. So that's how it's having its influence. I found, and I didn't mention this earlier, I did not find a moral communities effect. So some sociologists, especially if you do work on religion, will know what that is. That's like kind of the light switch effect that happens when more religious people are in more religious spaces. Sometimes we found, Rodney Stark found this, that their religious beliefs are kind of turned on. I don't find that, not at the country level anyway. And then with regards to changes in abortion attitudes in China, definitely people have become more opposed. Again, that is a moral dimension, not a legal dimension. I didn't find other shifts with regards to attitudes. There's an enduring impact of the one-child policy. There is greater rural opposition, but it hasn't increased even more for rural residents. Everybody on average have gotten more opposed. And then in conclusion, religion certainly matters for understanding abortion attitudes. It's hugely important, both at the individual and at the country level. It depends on the measure. So I hope, please, my social scientists in the group take that seriously. Think about one, including those measures, but then two, please include a general measure versus the just simply religious affiliation. China has a very unique policy legacy. It's remained to this day. It's affected people. I don't know. I guess the key takeaway would be abortion attitudes reflect, a complex mixture. And at the same time, we can find global trends. And that's really neat. I think that brings a lot to the table for how we understand attitudes more generally. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to discussion.
Thank you very much, Amy. What a fascinating story you have told us. We are now back to the audience, and we have already the first question. Please, Chris, go ahead.
Hey, Amy, nice to meet you in person for the first time. Great
Great to
talk.
meet you.
Very interesting results. What struck me the most is how similar the results are to an article that are published in Social Indicators Research with Amy Alexander and Ron Engelhardt in 2015. This was under the title Emancipating Sexuality, and the subtitle was Breakthroughs into a Bulwark of Tradition. The similarity of the analysis is quite striking. It's just two differences. In our trend analysis and the multi-level model, we were a little broader on the DV side, so on the dependent variable. So we summarized abortion tolerance with homosexuality tolerance and divorce tolerance into one variable, but the patterns are very similar. And on the IV side, so independent variables, we came to a similar result. But we have inverted sort of the thing and talked about secular values, so a less religiosity, but this had the strongest impact both on the societal level and at the individual level. And if you interact the two, it becomes even stronger. But we also went a little broader here in the measurement. We not looked, it was included, so the importance of God in your life on a 1 to 10 scale, but we also looked, so we defined secular values in a broader way, and that we said like it's more or less distance to all sources of quasi-divine authorities, which also includes the nation and, let's say, the father. So one question we also included here is how much people live their life in order to, quote, in order to make their parents proud. And more distanciation to those sources of authority, God, Father, and the fatherland. We defined this as secular values. And this was the strongest effect. So this is not a criticism, but it's simply a piece of information for reassurance that if you zoom in and just pick out one of those three factors, if it's tolerance of homosexuality or divorce or abortion, you probably get very similar results because they are hinging together into one syndrome of, let's say, like sexual reproductive tolerance.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christian. I appreciate that. And maybe this isn't the time. I would love to know your opinions about what happened in America. This is just a fascinating issue of views about same-sex relations becoming radically more liberal over a 20-year period, and abortion up until Roe v. Until the overturning of Roe v. Wade 3 years ago. Really, views about abortion had remained relatively stagnant. Not so much in the WVS, but if you look at other sources like the General Social Survey and a few others. So I definitely appreciate what you're saying. And with that, I think we should work together, and we need to put together a piece here about what is happening in America, which is, yeah, moving in ways that I certainly didn't anticipate. So thank you for that. And I am very aware of your awesome research. So thank you.
Thank you. We have our next question from John and then Sarah.
Yeah, hi. Well, thank you very much, Amy. That was great. And just, commenting on China, I mean, it was really great to see all the research presented, and we talked about it. But I'm a China wonk, so just noting first of all that the one-child policy started in 1980, not 1970, so that's important in terms of a historical analysis. But it was preceded by this later, longer, fewer campaign, which was promoting two in the cities cities and 3 in the countryside for most of the 80s. And then abortion, which was not at all approved or legal during the very pronatalist early days of the China regime, the post-49 China regime, was very restricted. It became more liberalized in just starting in the 70s with the later longer viewers. But taking it up to today, because of the push for more children now, the 3-child policy, the kind of overkill of the 1-child policy, and China's below replacement fertility, which the government is very concerned about. There are more restrictions on abortions these days, both legal and otherwise, attitudinally. So, it's shifting again, and it's going to be interesting to see, in the absence of the 1-child policy, more restrictions on abortions. How are attitudes changing if people feel they honestly can't? Young women who are in the workforce, especially, feel like they can't access abortion as easily. So that's going to be important to look at. And the other thing I would say is just trying to unpack the role of the 1-child policy in China from religion and other social attitudes. That's hard to do, obviously, because of the dominating role, as you've pointed out, of people's attitudes towards abortion because of the forced abortion kind of stuff, right? How could you look at like diaspora populations? I think Taiwan's a really good indicator of, what would China be like in the absence of the 1-child policy, but also looking at diaspora communities like in Malaysia and Penang, places which in Asia where they have similar cultural and religious and social traditions, but are not governed by, the China's harsh population policy. So, I mean, I just think it would be important to try to really look at what you looked at everywhere else in the world, in a Chinese population absent the 1-child policy, to really try to understand what the underlying attitudes and beliefs and social norms are about abortion. And I'm interested in the US too. I mean, like what happened in the US, as somebody who's worked a lot on reproductive health and rights my whole life, the transformation and the change in the United States is, not to be believed in many levels. So anyway, thank you very much. Super interesting.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joan. It's a real pleasure to see you and to talk with you. I just wanted to comment a little bit about religion in China. So, as you can imagine, in the U.S., religion came up all the time, like as from everyone, from doctors to policymakers to researchers. Everyone was like, "We have to think about this. We have to, include this." So it was interesting to be in China and to be in what we would call a very secular country with very low levels of religious belief. And so I think one of the things I try to do in the book is say, we know so much about the role of religion in shaping views in nations like the United States that are really quite religious. And we don't even understand anything in more secular nations. We understand things in secular Europe, sure. But what about in these very different contexts? And so it was an interesting way when people did talk about religion and abortion in China. There were a couple of insights that I thought, God, that we would never have that in the United States. And so people did, the experts that I talked to would talk a little bit about religion helping women cope. So, there was this sense of that in a lot of cases, women, it was just sort of this, they were resigned to that. In some cases, they had to have the abortion. It's not necessarily forced. Most of the time, it's not forced. It's not effective. But just this is just the pathway that I'm going to go forward because I'm not going to pay these fines and disrupt all these things. And I'm just not in a place where I necessarily want this. But religion was often a coping mechanism, and that was fascinating because in the U.S. we don't see that. We see religion stigmatizing. We don't see religion helping people cope. Religion helps them cope with other things like cancer and other stuff, but not with sort of the aftermath of maybe an abortion. And then the second way that it came up, and again, it was really fascinating, there was a real sense of like this narrative of, and this is related to kind of the polytheistic religion in China about you don't bring a child into the world that you can't take care of, and that you're actually doing a disservice. And so there's a lot of discourse about that. Like, if you're not ready for it, you let it go to the next person. Like the soul of the fetus will go on. So you're actually doing a disservice if you bring something into the world that can't be taken care of in the way that you want to take care of it. So a lot of that is obviously shaped also by the precious. You get one shot at this, or at least historically for many people, you got one shot, not always. But it was interesting. It was an interesting case because again, we just haven't. There's almost no research there on this. So it was neat for me as a sociologist who does a lot of work on religion. It was a new way of sort of thinking about the possibility of religion or how religion enters that discourse. So I see more questions.
Yes, thank you. We have Sarah next.
Thank you.
Sarah.
Really interesting. Thank you. And I recently rewatched John Oliver's explanation of the one-child policy, and it is fantastic. I mean, it was put into place by not sociologists or reproductive health specialists. It was by like nuclear scientists who thought, this is a problem and we need to solve it. And just the ramifications and the trauma of 2 generations of people being only allowed to have one child. And then, they're trying to now flip this switch back the other way. And human reproduction doesn't really work that way because it's so socially constructed and all of that. But I don't have anything else to say. I don't do any work in China, so that's a very lay person's understanding. But some of my work is both, I do work in sub-Saharan Africa and then in the US around abortion. And my work in Ghana, especially, which is by some measures one of the most religious countries in the world, is that depending on how you feel about abortion, that dictates how your religion feels about abortion. That the individual, so we, at the beginning of our abortion conferences, there's a prayer because every meeting starts with a prayer. And so these are all, very pro-choice, as we would say in the US, very open to reproductive freedom. And those people use their religion as the grounding for that. And so that it's almost that religion is backward, like it's not what causes your feelings, it's that you then make your religion support that. We also found big differences between the hard reasons, if abortion is justified for a hard reason versus a soft reason. And so I'm wondering, I know that these were questions about, is it justified? Well, on what grounds? I mean, that becomes a really important way that people think about their own abortion and the abortions of other people. Also, I will say that in the US, there is no difference in abortion rates by religion or religiosity. Because my personal circumstances will allow me to do this. I need this. You over there, God is going to punish you. But for me, God will understand why I needed to have this abortion. And in terms of the views in the US, we have some work about pre and post abortion amendments to state constitutions. And the number of people who switch from identifying as either not affiliated or pro-life to pro-choice because they hadn't ever had to think about it. And now all of a sudden you're taking a right away. And people who would have never said before, I am pro-choice, I believe in a woman's right to control her own body, now think, oh my gosh, are you going to tell me, my daughter, my sister, my other people what to do with their bodies? No way. And so it was in Ohio, I believe it was a 30-point swing from before and after their state ballot initiative that switched from pro-life to pro-choice. And so I think that it was complacency that mainly kept the numbers in the US so stagnant for so long. And now that it is actually something that a lot of people have to think about, it's really challenging people's pro-life label. Like if you are having, you have miscarried and you have a septic fetus, but it still happens to have a heartbeat, can we not treat you? I mean, that's the sort of that we're putting women into the ICU, putting their lives at danger, making their future fertility, they're not gonna be able to have children in the future. And that because you're quote unquote pro-life. I think that's one of the big drivers in the US.
Yeah. Sarah, we have so much to discuss. I will say this: if you have any information on Ghana, please send it my way. That is absolutely fascinating, and I tried to address some of these things in the book, but sometimes we just don't have the data. But I hear what you're saying. I will say, just as an aside, Sarah, there just starting now, there's some Ipsos. I don't know if people know this. There's some cross-national data from Ipsos that looks at the hard and soft reasons in a a global context. As far as I know, that's the first time where we're seeing this. So I have a colleague who's not on this call named Fernandez, and so we have a couple papers in the work. We just had one come out earlier this year after my book came out, of course. And you're absolutely right. Like the way people are thinking about this issue, and especially as somebody from the US, I often think in terms of pro-choice and pro-life. And now we know, I mean, maybe it seems obvious, but it's so much more complicated. And people's views change very quickly as soon as you say, well, is abortion okay during the third trimester? And suddenly people who are very pro-choice will quickly adjust and say, well, wait a minute, what's the reason? Is this a health and medical reason, or is it, and vice versa? So I think you're absolutely right, Sarah. And there's, including some of your great work, there's some really good stuff in this area being done in the US, and hopefully we'll get more in the global context as well. I will say in the global context, they're still not asking enough about religion. So if this is a huge driver of how people see these issues, and we just need better data, we need more information. If we know this might be a factor, let's get some better measures. But we are getting some better measures in terms of in the international context in terms of some of these distinctions. So please, 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 Sarah, stay in touch with me because I know you're doing some great work.
Happy to.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Chris.
Okay, yeah, it's very interesting discussion. I have another comment on the macro level perspective. I like your narrative that the religious denomination is actually not so important. It's the degree or the salience of religiosity that matters. Because what we found is that the orthodoxies in all religions, whether it's Islam, Christianity, or whatever comes to mind, they all preach the same what we call patriarchal sex norms, which have 4 to 5 elements that are similar across civilizations, actually, you can say. So women have to marry, so it's a must. Women have to marry early. That's number 2. Women have to be virgins before they marry. Number 4 is women have then to be available for sex in order to give birth to many children. So these what we call patriarchal sex, fertility, and family norms, and they have just one purpose: to maximize male control over female sexuality. This is what this is all about. And this came evolutionary probably from societies where outnumbering neighboring tribes was very important. The thing, however, is usually religiosity is a first-rate indicator of this kind of conservatism or patriarchy, but not in East Asia. Because most of those countries have, in one way or the other, being under the imprint of Confucianism, which is an inherently secular kind of cosmology, if you like. There is not many thoughts about how the afterlife is looking, but you underestimate the conservatism in East Asia if you look at, or in Confucian countries, if you look at religiosity, because they appear very secular. But if you look behind the curtain, there's ancestor worship. And if you look at other indicators of conservatism, for instance, that one question we have in the World Value Survey, I live my life to make my parents proud. All Confucian imprinted societies score very high on this. So only looking at religiosity as an indicator is, for East Asian countries, not appropriate. We saw this also in our multi-level models because we plugged in, because of this, on the country level, an East Asia dummy to predict how high is the tolerance of homosexuality, abortion, and divorce. So the 3 put together. And East Asia dummy always turned out as very significant with a negative sign. So if it's an East Asian country that is imprinted by Confucianism, you have a negative impact on those kinds of attitudes. And I bet my house this is true for abortion for sure as well.
Yeah, Christian, thank you so much for your comments. I need you to read my book. I got a whole chapter on Confucianism, and I bet you we have some really great overlap. So I find some of these effects as well. And the book also talks a lot about the narrative in these countries where you're actually talking to people and say, well, how does this work? Or how does this enter into perspective? So please, 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 let's connect. Let's keep this dialogue moving because I think there's more work to be done. There's a lot more work to be done in this area. So thank you so much. I see a lot of people on this call, and I thank you. Thanks for coming out on this Friday morning and spending some time with us. So I really appreciate it. And any one of you, you can all find me online. Please be in touch if there's anything, any ideas, anything as stuff moves forward. Thankfully the research is moving at a good pace, and so I think there's a lot we can learn, and we can learn a lot in a relatively short amount of time. So thank you, and yeah, let's keep this going.
Thank you very much, Amy. We received several questions in chat. Perhaps you can spend another moment to provide brief answers. So Heather Price is asking, is there any interaction effect of gender of the respondent with religious and social indicators? And we have
Yeah,
a question from Ruby Amanda about the situation in African countries.
absolutely. Let me see. So I think that's Heather Price. Hi, Heather.
That's right.
If you're there. Yeah. So gender, I'll just say this about gender, and Heather might maybe already knows this. Gender is a really fascinating thing in this research because women are not that different than men. And in the United States, there's been a lot of discussion about that. A very high proportion of women voted for Trump the first time. And this was really surprising because he had said some pretty awful things about women. And so it's an interesting paradox. Like at least in the US, why would women be voting for somebody who really doesn't seem to represent their interests? But women are more religious than men on average. And so there's been some research, I'm thinking of Schnabel's research, for example, that has suggested that it's because they are more religious that they tend to the differences between men and women decrease. So yeah, Heather's pointing that out as well. So that's really fast. I do find a difference between men and women in my data analysis, but Heather, I have 200,000 people, so very small differences at the micro level are popping out. The effect sizes aren't especially profound, and of course, the whole world isn't always necessarily that religious. If you can look at Europe, for example. So that's a great question. I don't know if I've answered that.
Yeah, no, and I was actually thinking a little bit on a flip side of men who are more religious, if they're driving up, if that tends to create more if their slope is steeper. So that women have more moderate views overall, and then the religiosity changes the slope. But if there's kind of a steeper slope for men, of those men who are more religious, are they driving the average up for disapproval among the religious? That was actually, which is a little flip of what we normally think about, because we are usually thinking about it from the women's perspective. But because it's a distal outcome for men, if they can have the luxury of being more extreme on their views on it.
Yeah, Heather, I think you're onto something. I don't think I tested that, but I know what you're talking about because I've been seeing some stuff in the New York Times talking about young men and higher levels of religious belief and spaces where toxic masculinity will be, like that discourse is changing. So I think there's I got to test that. Maybe you test that with me. But I think there might be something there. And certainly we need to keep an eye on that in the US. But I wonder, that's a great, I got it down. I'm gonna take a look. I'm gonna be back in touch with you, Heather. Any other questions, or I'm gonna ask my wonderful moderator. Do I need to go, or what would you prefer?
I have one more if you allow, because Heather's input just reminded me of one of the things it's laying in my drawer, but I wanted to write a paper about one thing. It's relating to gender. We do find gender differences usually being pretty small when we look at value orientations from the World Value Survey. For instance, it's very interesting to see. We have this one question, no one wants to have a war, but if there is a war, are you willing to fight for your country? And you split this up between women and men. If the average in the country says like 40% say we are willing to fight for the country, the difference between men and women is small. So let's say if the average is 40%, 45% of men say this, and 35% of women say that. So it's a relatively small difference, but the gravity field of the national culture puts both genders into the orbit, so to speak. And this is interesting because in most countries, women are not part of the combative force, but they answer with a certain distance similar to men. And we find this in all kinds of questions. The gender differences are small, but consistent in direction. I have never seen a regression where the variable gender switches sign on a dependent variable. So the differences go there. They are universally and always in the same direction, but relatively small. This is an interesting observation on which we have not really theorized so far. Which reminds me, and this is a bit propaganda. We have on the 4th of July, 2 o'clock CET, I think Xenia circulated it over the WVS network, a symposium under the title Breaking the Glass Ceiling / Sealing the Leaky Pipeline, with 2 keynotes and a panel of discussants where we discuss why women are still, or why the trend of gender progression or women's empowerment is stalling, especially in the field of academic careers. So we have an online link to this. Please join.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chris. We need to talk a lot more because I think we've got some exciting places where we can collaborate and maybe even including in this area. So thank you. Thanks for your comments.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your excellent presentation and for staying a bit longer to answer our questions. Thank you very much for joining us today. This session has been recorded. The recording will be available at the WS YouTube channel. So if your colleagues missed it or if you want to watch it again, it is out there. And I believe Amy shared her email, so you are welcome, I hope, to contact in case of questions.
Yes,
Right?
please. Yeah.
Yes, and take a moment to look at the book or buy it to read. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye.